All right, so in the last video we figured out what an array is, or at least we saw it on a PowerPoint slide. But how do I use it in my code, and how does it work? Well, let's start laying out some arrays. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is make it pretty simple. We'll take that same example we had before. So I'm going to write string because I'm going to make a string array, which means everything in this array is going to be strings. And we're going to use the brackets to indicate that we're going to make an array this time. I'm going to call my variable animals. And I'm going to do an open and close bracket and put in my initial values. Now this is a syntax, this is a format we can do when we start when we first declare an array. We can't just hard code these in a list once we've already initialized our array. But if we're initializing an array immediately and we know exactly what the values are, this is sort of a shortcut to an array, and I'll show you the next way after we're done with this one. Anyway, so I've created a string array of, I call it animals, and there's these animals in that array. And so like we saw in our example, I'm going to do a write line, and I'm going to print out, let's say, cat. Can you remember what index that's going to be? So I'm going to write animals, and then the brackets, and cats is not 0, cats is 1. Remember, all indexes in an array start with the number 0, so dog is 0, cat is 1. And then we'll put the read key so we can see this in work. So as I run it, what I'll do is I'm going to set a breakpoint so we can see things happening. Hit run, things are building, and then we come to our debugger. So right now we have our array is empty, it's null, there's nothing in it because at this point that line hasn't run yet. So I'm going to hit the step into, and then the next thing I see is the animals array has been filled. So if I look in my locals window here, I can see that sure enough array 0 is dog, array index of animals of 1 is cat, animals array of 2 is elephant, and so on. So when this continues to run, then we can see that in fact cat did get displayed. All right, so let's look at another way to play with arrays. So we hard coded in the array values here. So I'm going to comment that out, and we'll do it in a different way now. So now what I'm going to do is, again, state my intentions to declare an array, and it's going to be a type of animals. I don't know what values I want to put in, so they're going to be filled later on in the code. So I'm going to not type up there, I'm going to type down here. I'm going to create a new array of ints, and at the time I declare it, I'm creating it now. So here I just declared it and I hard coded it, but now I'm going to actually declare a place in memory, and I'm going to say that this particular, I guess it's 4, this particular array of animals is going to have 4 elements. So I have to declare at this point in time how big my array is going to be. It doesn't get to change throughout the code. It's going to be exactly what it's going to be when I created it. No more, no less, I can't change it. So now I've said I have an animals array. It's going to have, it's not an int, it's a string, isn't it? There we go. So that gets rid of those red ugly curly lines. All right, so we've got a string array of animals that has 4 slots in it. And then one way, we're just going to make it simple for now, one way to fill those slots is directly with the index animals of 0 is equal to dog, and animals of 1 is equal to, I guess, cat, animals of 2 is equal to whatever it was, I don't remember now, oops, wasn't paying attention, is equal to hippo. All right, I'm going to leave the 4th one blank because I don't know what the 4th one is. I wonder if it'll still work. Well, sure, it'll still work. So let's walk through our code again. All right, and if we look at our code, we can see that we have in fact filled 3 of those slots, and we've left the last slot is still null. So now when we print our animals of 1, that cat should print out. And if we run it, sure enough, cat gets printed out. All right, well, let's keep expanding on that notion. We wrote here just one animal, but what if we want to loop through all of them and loop the results of all of the animals? So we can do that with a for loop. So let me indent my right line because we're going to put that in a for loop. Now, I can very easily, there's two ways to do this, but let's take it the correct way, and then I'll show you what works but isn't quite as correct, and I'll tell you why. So the first thing I'm going to do is create an integer that's called the length of array. And what I'm going to use this integer for is to determine how many elements are in this array. Now, you might think that there's 3 elements in this array because we've only filled 3. Well, we're going to use, let me just type it out, animals.length. We're going to use the length property, and the length property returns the size of the array. In other words, how many elements are in the array. You and I think that there's 3 because we've only filled it with the 3 of the slots, but this will actually return 4 and not 3 because that's what we initialized it as. We said it had 4 element slots in it. So now that I know the length of it, I can loop through it. Int I equals 0. This should look familiar. And then as long as I is less than the length of the array, and then I plus plus. Okay, now let's see how we can put this into action. I'm going to just type for a moment and then talk. Now instead of 1, I'm going to put I. So what I'm doing here is looping through the for loop as long as this I is less than the length that was determined in this value, in this variable. Print out the index of I. So when I is 0, it'll print out animals of 0. Well, that works. When it gets to the next loop, it's 1. So I is 1, print out animals of 1. So this looping condition, this looping block, will print out every element of the array. Now, what I suggested was that this is the efficient way to do it. You could put, if I didn't want to, let's just, oops, that's Python. Okay. Let's say we wanted to do animals.length here. Well, can I do that? Well, sure you can do that. But here's the thing. Length. So you type it right. This will work too. The problem with this is it's not quite as efficient of code because every time we loop through this loop, you're asking the compiler to evaluate what length is. If you instead use this format, it's just more efficient because we already know what the length is. There's no calculation that needs to be done each and every iteration of that loop. And so it's more efficient. Now to you it might not seem that big a deal because we're not doing very big loop, but if the loops get big in size, that can definitely play a performance factor. We want to be good coders. Okay, so we're going to use length of array. We're going to print out animals of I, and let's see what happens. So I will run it. We're going to do a breakpoint there. We'll look at our array. Remember that we have a null. So I think rather than looping through, let's just run it. Okay, and so we can see that dog, cat, hippo was printed. There's a big space left where null ended up being, so it printed all, including the null. So we're looping through an array, and we used a for loop to do it. And we're looking good so far. All right, so the last way, or another way that we can loop through our array is with a for each loop. So I'm just going to comment out this particular code, and we're going to look at a different way to loop through it. Now, the for loop is very good to loop through it and also helps us keep track of I. So if we needed to know what position was found, or if we were doing some kind of an encounter or that kind of thing, this is a good construct to use because I is keeping track of a number. But if all we care about is just printing out the value, we can use a for each loop. And a for each loop works very nicely with collections, as it's called, or with our array in this case. So we're going to use, I'm going to let it know that we're going to be looking for strings, and I'm going to call it string animal in animals. And what I'm doing here is stalling while I'm talking. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're saying we're going to have a temporary variable named animal. And so animal is going to hold the value of each item in the array, each element in the array, as we loop through animals. So the key word here is for each, in. So we have a for each and an in. In other words, for each animal, which is the variable that's going to hold the value in this collection or in this array. So right line, I'll run this so we can see all of that working so my words have more meaning. Right animal. Spelled correctly probably would be a good idea. There we go. Okay, so we'll walk through this and we'll see that. All right, so the first time we come through, we can see that animal is holding the value dog. So this is the temporary value. It changes every time we go through the for each loop. For each, here's your variable, our keyword in, and then this is your collection or our array in this case. So if I step through it again, there's our keyword, and now animal is cat, and it continues on throughout the array. And so I'm going to get rid of our breakpoint and finish this out so that we can then see it's looped through the array and it's printed out all the elements. So notice I'm not keeping track of any numbers. I'm not counting how many there are. I don't know what index each of them are. It just looped through them all so that way I can, if I just need to print out the values. So that's the beginning of arrays. We've seen how we can initialize an array if we have the values right off the bat. If we don't have the values right away, we can declare our variable and set a location in memory with however many elements we need. Remember, we have to put the elements at the time we initialize it. We can fill the array by using the index, so we can put values into it. We can get the length of how many slots in memory are in that array. We could loop through it with our for loop, so that gives us the ability to look at all the different elements one by one in the array by using I as our index. Or we use the for each, where we just loop through all of the properties and all of the values and printed out the value using the keywords for each and in. So that's the beginning of arrays.